Welcome to Dialogue. The Trump administration announced a reduction of forces in Afghanistan and Iraq that will take place 5 days before President-elect Joe Biden is due to be sworn in to office. That will leave 2,500 troops in each country, with situations in both countries still considered challenging. Does this signal an end to America's wars overseas? What will Joe Biden do next? And how can enduring stability and development be achieved in these places? To find out more, I'm joined by Teng Jianqun, Director for the Center of Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies, Fouad Aizadi, Associate Professor of American Studies from the University of Tehran, and Shuja Nawaz, a Distinguished Fellow at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. That is our topic. I'm Wang Guan. Mr. Nawaz in Washington, D.C., let me go to you first. What are your interpretations of this move? Why does Trump decide to do this now, other than securing a legacy?
Well, as you know, this was part of his plan when he thought that he would win a second term. And this was part of his campaign promise when he began to run for office in the campaign in 2016, that he would end all American wars. So as far as he was concerned, this was the fulfillment of a promise that he had made to the American people. Unfortunately, it has not yet been completed, and it won't be completed till May, at least for Afghanistan. And there has been no final deadline set for the removal of the final remaining U.S. troops from Iraq.
Yeah, I want to stay on the subject of Trump's military policy over there, because we do see some contradictions whereby Trump has to balance, one faction in his party, his GOP party, that is, the grassroots GOP, calling for an isolationist policy, no intervention, no money spent on regime changes. But on the other hand, we see the GOP elites, the military-industrial complex, asking Trump to increase the military budget. Trump also said he wants to build the strongest military on earth. How do you think Trump has been able to or unable to balance those forces? Mr. Nawaz.
Well, in terms of supporting the defense budget, he has done his best to do that throughout his term. But as I said, because he lost the election, he's not going to be able to continue any of these policies. And you have President-elect Joe Biden and his team coming in, and he is at his disposal a lot of expertise, especially dealing with Afghanistan and Iraq on his team, and in the Middle East region in general. So he will be much better equipped to get better advice on how to handle U.S. relations in that region.
Mr. Aizadi in Tehran, how do you look at Trump's decision to withdraw, even more troops from both Afghanistan and Iraq? And at this point, what will be the security implications for both countries?
I agree with your guest from Washington, Mr. Nawaz. President Trump promised to end the endless wars that the U.S. has engaged in. He wanted to completely withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, as far as we can tell from reports that are coming from Washington. And he also complained about the military-industrial complex in the interview that he had with Fox News some months ago. So he realizes that U.S. war policies have been a major failure. He realizes that
but the military-industrial complex remained to be a major donor for Trump,
on these failed policies over 7. You need to check on that. When he first ran in 2016, he used a lot of his own money, because the Republican Party elites did not really like him being the nominee. And for his second run in 2020, he accused Biden of being in the pocket of the Wall Street bankers and financiers. So how much, he used to say that he likes generals. He actually employed a number of retired generals in his cabinet, but gradually he got rid of them. And he realizes that in order to have a legacy for himself, he needs to fulfill some of these type of promises. And as you mentioned correctly, the Republican voters really don't like this type of warmongering policies. They don't want their tax dollars to be spent in foreign wars when there's so much need inside the United States. But Trump is going to be out of office in 5 days, and then the Biden administration, I think, is going to do things differently.
Director Tang, how do you look at Trump's policies in Afghanistan and Iraq for the past 4 years?
Actually, this is a continuation of the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Middle East and from Afghanistan, actually initiated by the former President Barack Obama. He announced that the United States had ended the 10 years anti-terrorist war in that region. So I think it is a commitment by President Trump during his campaign in 2016. But this is a tendency for the United States to withdraw troops home. President Trump just gave some, clear-cut signals to the outside world that he will not, afford any prices related to the wars in Middle East, in Afghanistan. Even, he announced the plan to withdraw troops from Europe. I think this is a policy of this administration. He will not give any money to these areas, and also he would like to get support from the public, especially the grassroots, the soldiers, the officers. Actually, most of them are from the grassroots level. So this is actually a policy for his own politics to mobilize support at home.
Yeah. And then what do you think will happen in 5 days when Joe Biden is sworn in? Will there be a continuation of this policy, or Biden will perhaps chart a new course?
Yeah, I think the president-elect, when he takes office 4 days later, I'm sure he will continue the policy to withdraw his military presence in these regions. It is a policy adopted by himself. During Obama's administration, he was vice president, and I'm sure Joe Biden will, reconstruct the balance of power in the Middle East, because President Trump just changed the policy to fight against Iran, to gave great support to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and this is one side policy against another side. So I think Joe Biden might take balanced relations with all the countries in the Middle East, not only the allies of the United States.
Right. We have seen very heavy emphasis on a pro-Israeli policy, to say the least. Mr. Nawaz in Washington, D.C., let me go back to you and talk about really the well-being of the region, the countries that we're talking about, Iraq and Afghanistan, who are really at the center of these policies. At the end of the day, it's the Iraqis and Afghans who are bearing the brunt of these policies. We had a lesson of 2014 when a troop withdrawal was criticized, for the rise of ISIS, leaving a security vacuum. Do you foresee such situations emerging again this time around?
It's eminently possible for some of the terrorist groups, particularly the international terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, to try and make a comeback if there's a complete withdrawal from the region and a disengagement, which means no economic aid of any substance either. And I think that's a huge risk for the United States and its coalition partners in Afghanistan in particular, but also in Iraq, which needs to be standing on its own feet in order to be able to take advantage of its location as well as its resources in the region, and not to be seen as in any way being lost, quote unquote, to Iran or to any other regional power in the Middle East. So there will be a balancing act, but I think there will be a major shift in focus to counterterrorism, much more so than a big U.S. presence or a big coalition presence that will sustain the war effort in Afghanistan or even in Iraq. Already Iraq has been winding down. Afghanistan is almost at the point where the number of troops are going to be so small, U.S. troops, that they will have trouble guarding themselves. So there's a huge risk if there's a major Afghan attack, a Taliban attack on U.S. forces, that the public opinion at home will force Mr. Biden's hands and force him to bring the troops back earlier than May.
And then you mentioned in an interview earlier that the U.S. needs to work with Iran, Russia, and China to be able to better enable Afghanistan to achieve lasting peace. Can you elaborate?
Certainly. As you know, I recently wrote a new book called The Battle for Pakistan, and the subtitle was The Bitter U.S. Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood. And I've discussed this whole issue in there because when the U.S. went in, it didn't have a very clear notion of why it wanted to be in Afghanistan. It talked about removing al-Qaeda, but then it got involved with nation building and so many other things. It didn't take advantage of the initial collaboration even with Iran that helped the U.S. during its efforts after the invasion in Afghanistan. I think it's very critical that the tripartite relationship that exists now between, say, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia involves China also, because China has economic interests as well as strategic interests in the region, and China wants multiple paths to the Gulf and beyond. And so it's very critical that the Biden administration come up with a regional approach. And my view is, because the team that surrounds Joe Biden has many people with expertise in the region as well as language abilities. People, like the new nominee for the head of the CIA, people like Tony Blinken, who worked on Iran, on the region, and Joe Biden himself, who knows Afghanistan and Iran and Pakistan extremely well personally from countless trips there. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm quite optimistic that instead of the U.S. being the main force in trying to stabilize the region, that they will rely on the region stabilizing itself with the U.S. and its partners providing economic assistance over a sustained period to keep the governments alive and well and to be able to serve their people.
Right. Professor Aizadi in Tehran, let me go to you. I want to take a step back and look at the big picture here. How successful do you think the U.S. military engagement has been after 20 years of what they call the war on terror in both Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, if you measure success by killing innocent women and children, wasting a lot of money and causing difficulties for these countries, then the U.S. program has been quite successful. But if you measure success by achieving legitimate foreign policy goals or legitimate national security interests, then it has been a major failure. The U.S. government invaded Afghanistan, killed a lot of people, arguing that they needed to punish the Taliban. And for the last number of years, they're actually getting very close to the Taliban, negotiating with them and asking the Qatari government to host them. With regard to Iraq, they talked about weapons of mass destruction, and that was the excuse for attacking Iraq. Obviously, they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, but the invasion of Iraq resulted in increasing terrorism. You had different terrorist organizations, including ISIS, that occupied large portions of Iraq, and it was actually with the help of Iranian troops, including the assassinated Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, that the Iraqi government was finally able to kick ISIS out of the country. Their policy in Syria is obviously a major failure, and it was President Obama and his people that called for the overthrow of the Syrian government. That obviously didn't happen, but a lot of Syrians got killed, and the U.S. is obviously responsible for all the support they gave to terrorist organizations in Syria. Their policy in Yemen is a failure. Their policy in Lebanon is a failure. And one would hope that the Biden administration would learn from these major policy failures in the past and do something new. That's something that people are hoping for, but the statements that are coming from Biden and people around him is not very encouraging. They belong to this liberal internationalist doctrine in U.S. foreign policy. They say that liberalism is very good, and they can use force to spread liberalism whenever necessary. Obviously, there's a lot of hypocrisy there. The U.S. is a major supporter of the most heinous dictatorships in this part of the world, including the Saudi government that engages in financing a lot of terrorism. So overall, the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been a failure, and I think what people of this region need to do, people from Asia, is to have their own security setup. I think what President Xi of China talked about in 2014, having a security arrangement around among Asian countries would be the best answer. Something like an Asian NATO. So when there are problems in Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or other places in Asia, then Asian countries, including Iran, Russia, China, Pakistan, Turkey, other regional countries could deal with these problems on their own. They don't need Americans coming to this part of the world thousands of miles away. And what we have seen from the American foreign policy is that they make things much worse than when they come here, and they cause a lot of difficulties for people of this region and also their own people.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. We do need to hear from more voices and people like yourself from the region or studying the region. Director Tang, our previous guest talked about President Xi's proposal of letting Asians figuring out the affairs of Asia. How do you look at that?
This is a very good job for all the countries concerned in this region to maintain the peace and stability. I think the number one job for the countries concerned, for example, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, is the national building. The origin of the turmoil or the proliferation of terrorism in these countries actually is a result of the use of force by the United States. The U.S. forces and other NATO forces use the force against the traditional system of the society and the balance of power in this region, completely destroyed the order of social life, and they failed to construct a new system to maintain the peace and stability in an individual country. So this is actually a result of the use of force by the Western countries in this region. I think the number one job for all the countries concerned is to find a way out of such a dilemma, not only to use force against each other, but also to find a platform to cooperate, to get out of such a dilemma, to get the nation building as a number one job.
Yeah, talking about getting out of this dilemma, there has been this ongoing talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Mr. Nawaz in Washington, D.C., I want to go back to you and borrow your expertise. There has been rounds of talks, nothing super concrete coming out of the previous round in Doha. What are the sticking points between the Taliban and the Afghan government right now?
Well, the biggest issue currently is that the talks have stalled, and the two leaders of the Taliban group are back in Pakistan. Whether they are back in order to consult further with their colleagues and with their Pakistani hosts is unclear. But clearly the talks are not proceeding, and Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who is the outgoing administration's special representative for the region, has been in Afghanistan, but President Ghani refused to meet him because President Ghani believes that he is trying to set up some kind of a deal for a national government. Now, as we've all been talking about, only 4 or 5 days are left before the new administration is sworn in. And so Zalmay Khalilzad's tenure will end, and we don't know as yet as to who will take over that job of being the liaison with the Taliban. It's very critical that Pakistan continue to play a positive role in this and try and support all efforts for a peaceful settlement, because a stable Afghanistan will mean a stable Pakistan. Otherwise, the border region in Balochistan as well as in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan will constantly remain under threat from Pakistani dissidents who have sought refuge in Afghanistan. The same applies to Iran. On the western side, Iran needs to help Afghanistan maintain the economy and peace in that region. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other regional organizations are already in place for the connectivity and trade and development within the region that the other guests were talking about earlier. I think this is going to be critical for the long run. We do have to keep in mind that the President of the United States is going to be heavily engaged in domestic economic recovery. This is going to be very tough to draw his attention and the support from the U.S. Congress for any major initiatives in Afghanistan on the economic side, and certainly not for any more military adventures.
Yeah, Pakistan, of course, is a main stakeholder in the region, and we understand that Pakistan suffered more from terrorism, more death toll than any other country in the region, of course, including the United States. Professor Aizadi, let me go to you. You talk about, the importance of setting up, domestic institutions in Iraq and Afghanistan and how important that is for economic growth and development. How do you envision, such a setup of institutions allowing both societies to prosper happen?
A major problem that the Iraqi government has is the relationship that the Iraqi government has with the United States. Iraq is an oil-producing country. They make a lot of money selling oil, but this money is more or less deposited in American banks. And for the Iraqi government to be able to use its own money, a lot of times they need to get permission from the United States. And the U.S. Policy has been to make sure that Iraq stays within U.S.'s sphere of influence. So, for example, when you had the previous Iraqi Prime Minister al-Mahdi visiting China, and he was a Maoist when he was younger. When he was much younger, he liked Chinese model of economy. He wanted to have a lot of economic cooperation with China, and the U.S. ambassador opposed this sovereign country's prime minister, Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi, to have close relations with China. And one of the reasons you had demonstrations and the political system there that finally led Prime Minister al-Mahdi to resign was because of the pressure that he was receiving from the United States, because he wanted to have good relations with countries like China and Iran. So when a country is occupied, you're not going to have institutions and policy processes that benefits that country. You're going to have institutions and policy processes fighting for. And that may be one reason that the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution shortly after the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani last year for the US forces to leave Iraq. That's what the Iraqi parliament wanted. That is what the Iraqi people want in public opinion polls. And with the Biden administration, we don't see that happening. I think the Biden administration likes to occupy Iraq and continue to have American forces there. And that's going to be difficult because sooner or later Iraqis get tired of this type of occupation and they may have to force Americans out of Iraq. And the same thing is true with regard to Afghanistan. There is no justification for the US troops to stay in Afghanistan. As I said, the excuse was to punish the Taliban, but that was a long time ago and they're not punishing Taliban at all. The only reason they want to stay in Afghanistan to have bases so they could use these bases to put pressure on China and Russia and Iran and other regional countries, and that is not a good excuse. Afghanistan is an independent country. So as long as we have the Americans occupying this part of the world and being in a lot of places, last time I counted, Americans have about 150 bases in the Middle East. And that's just too much. They don't need to be here. They have a lot of internal problems. The good policy for the Biden administration would be to resolve some of these difficulties that they have internally so the US Congress doesn't get occupied by protesters. And instead of interfering in other people's affairs and occupying other countries, they need to fix their own problems.
Yeah, foreign policy starts at home. Director Tung, how do you look at China's role and the solutions perhaps in helping Afghanistan and Iraq?
First, I should say the Chinese government has attached great importance to the peace and stability in our neighboring countries, such as in Afghanistan. And China, second, I think China would like to play an important role, for example, in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and in bilateral or multilateral approach to get peace in Afghanistan. And to my knowledge, years ago, Chinese government invited Taliban delegation to China. I think the main purpose for such invitation is to get institution or get a platform for all the parties concerned to sit down to find the way out of such a dilemma and to go ahead to maintain the peace and stability. It's not only for the sake of these countries, but also for the sake of China. China's development, the domestic development heavily relies on the stable and peaceful neighboring countries.
Yeah, we do share a border on the Xinjiang's, China's Xinjiang region over there, and a lot is at stake. I want to thank you, Director Tung. Always good to see you, Professor Aizadi in Tehran, and Mr. Nawaz in Washington D.C. Thank you all so very much. Have a good day. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing.